episode 10 of Law and Batting Order. I'm your host, Tony Iliakostas. Here are some quick hits from the past week. The Hebrew Hammer has struck again, this time off the field. In December of 2011, shortly after being named Major League Baseball's National League MVP, Milwaukee Brewers outfielder Ryan Braun tested positive for elevated levels of testosterone and a prohibited substance that was neither a drug nor a steroid. Braun was subsequently banned for 50 games. Braun fought the ban and appealed. Surprisingly, he won. While Braun explained that the substance in his urine was used for a private medical issue, he won his appeal after an arbitration panel voted that Braun's urine sample was mishandled by one of MLB's test collectors. This has raised some concern in terms of the drug testing policy in Major League Baseball and whether or not it's reliable. Nevertheless, Braun is back in uniform and ready to help his Brew crew pick up where they left off last season as the top team in the NL Central. The NFL season may be over, but the NFL Combine is underway. The Combine is the place where college athletes entering the draft display their talents in front of scouts around the league and show that they are worth being drafted. The talk of this year's Combine is without question the competition between Baylor QB Robert Griffin III and Stanford QB Andrew Luck. Both players have shown during their tenure as quarterbacks in their respective schools that they are capable of being elite quarterbacks in a highly competitive league. Mariano Rivera may be a closer, but is his career coming to a close? Earlier this week, as Yankees pitchers and catchers reported in Florida in preparation for spring training, there was speculation that the Yankees legend will be retiring at the conclusion of this season. Rivera remains secretive about his decision, saying that only he has made up his mind, but is not telling anyone. The 17-year veteran has collected 603 career saves, is a 5-time World Series champion, and is the all-time postseason saves leader with 42 saves. Today's Order in the Court will cover homicide. This past Wednesday, former University of Virginia men's lacrosse player George Huguely V was found guilty of second-degree murder and grand larceny for the death of his former girlfriend, University of Virginia women's lacrosse player Yeardley Love. Both of these charges carried jail time of around 6 to 60 years altogether. However, it was suggested by the jury that Huguely be sentenced to 25 years for second-degree murder and 1 year for grand larceny. George Huguely and Yeardley Love were both student athletes at the University of Virginia. They dated briefly but had split up. In May of 2010, they were weeks away from graduating. But on May 3, 2010, Yeardley Love was found dead lying in a pool of blood and was ruled to have died from blunt force trauma to the head. George Huguely was brought in by police for questioning. Huguely waived his Miranda rights and told Charlottesville, Virginia police that he was involved in an altercation with Yeardley Love and that during the course of the altercation, he shook Love violently and her head repeatedly hit the wall. Friends of Huguely reported to police that he drank excessively and increasingly the weeks before Love died, and Huguely said he had more than a dozen beers and wine prior to seeing Love on the night of her death. Huguely also admitted to taking Love's laptop after leaving her apartment and throwing it in a dumpster. Although George Huguely was found guilty of second-degree murder, it's worth mentioning what it means to be found guilty of this charge. In today's episode, we'll be discussing this issue. What are the necessary requirements to be found guilty of second-degree murder, and how do they apply to former University of Virginia lacrosse player George Huguely? For the record, I was unable to obtain any court documents or records from the Charlottesville, Virginia court where Huguely was tried. Hence, this episode is based on facts I collected from newspaper articles and my knowledge of criminal law from my criminal law course in law school. The Virginia Annotated Code, Section 18.2-32, defines first and second-degree murder. This was the statute that George Huguely was charged under. The statute reads as follows: murder other than capital murder by poison, lying in wait, imprisonment, starving, or by any willful, deliberate, and premeditated killing, or in the commission of or attempt to commit arson, rape, forcible sodomy, inanimate or animate object sexual penetration, robbery, burglary, or abduction, is murder of the first degree, punishable as a Class II felony. All murder other than capital murder and murder in the first degree is murder of the second degree and is punishable by confinement in a state correctional facility for not less than 5 nor more than 40 years. This statute adopts the run-of-the-mill common law standard of murder with minor variations. First, this statute says that a defendant can be found guilty of first-degree murder if the defendant committed a murder in connection with a felony or intended to kill with premeditation and deliberation. Felony murder might be irrelevant in this matter because we don't know, based on the facts, if George Huguely stealing Yeardley Love's laptop was in connection with the murder. However, we can analyze whether or not Huguely intended to kill with premeditation and deliberation. Intent in the statute means that the actor acted purposely or knowingly. If you recall from episode 5 on mens rea, to act purposely means that it was the actor's conscious objective to perform the act, and to act knowingly means that the actor was practically certain that a prohibited conduct would lead to a prohibited result. It was a matter for the prosecution to prove that Huguely premeditated and deliberated his actions. To premeditate means to think about committing an act prior to performance of the act. To deliberate means to weigh the consequences of the act. Here it appears that the prosecution was unable to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Huguely premeditated and deliberated his actions. It's likely that Huguely's highly intoxicated state impaired his ability to think and even weigh the consequences of killing Yeardley Love. After all, he admitted to drinking over a dozen bottles of beer and wine prior to his encounter with Yeardley Love on the night of her death. It is very likely that consuming that much alcohol could hamper one's ability to think beforehand how the plan will be carried out while also weighing the consequences of the act or acts. In this regard, first-degree murder wouldn't apply in the case of George Huguely. Yet there is sufficient proof that explains why Huguely was convicted of second-degree murder. Adopting the common law standard of homicide with Virginia's homicide statute with respect to second-degree murder, the prosecution could have proved that Huguely simply intended to kill, intended to cause grievous bodily harm, committed a Braveheart murder, or killed Yeardley Love in a state of hot blood. In this matter, and for the sake of brevity, I think there is one second-degree murder charge that applies which prosecution most likely proved. That is, the intent to cause grievous bodily harm. Under the criminal common law, the defendant does not necessarily want to kill, but intends to cause harm that could potentially lead to death. This is the definition of intent to cause grievous bodily harm. In this case, the facts fit perfectly with this rule. Perhaps George Huguely didn't want to kill Yeardley Love. Maybe in his drunken state, when he kicked down Love's door and raided her apartment, he just wanted to cause harm. It is very possible that George Huguely thought that assaulting Love would simply cause harm. However, by shaking Yeardley Love violently and hitting her head on a wall repeatedly without stopping suggests that Huguely was intending to cause harm, but his harm escalated to death as Love lay face down on her own bed in a pool of her own blood after suffering blunt force trauma to the head. Based on this reasoning, this is how former collegiate lacrosse player George Huguely was found guilty of second-degree murder for the death of Yeardley Love. That's the show. Leave all your comments down below, and be sure to visit Law and Batting Order at lawandbattingorder.com, as well as on Facebook and Twitter. Until next time, have a great week, guys.